If we are to learn from fantasy to improve how we play SuperCoach, we must first study its past. And today, that's exactly what we'll do. We'll delve into a concise history of how fantasy and SuperCoach have evolved over really the last decade. And through those changes, it'll then set us up to actually determine what are the differences between the games and how we can use it to improve how we play SuperCoach. But first, let's start with the history. And I've decided to bring it back to 2013, which was when some of the last real major changes to the game started and actually where their modern eras, I'd say, kicked off. Major changes swept through both AFL Fantasy and Supercoach as player positions underwent a significant shift. Prior to 2013, they had 7 defenders, 7 forwards, and 6 mids in their current sides, as well as the 2 rucks that we're accustomed to. And in 2013, this changed for the first time to 6 defenders, 6 forwards, and 8 mids. And from there, the changes didn't stop, and it marked a significant divergence in both games' paths. AFL Fantasy embraced a faster, more flexible offering, going to 44 trades, or what some people call unlimited trades, but effectively allowing players to have 2 each week for the year, use it or lose it, while Supercoach increased trades from 24 to 30, having previously been as low as 20 back a few years prior to that, but still keeping true to what they wanted to do, which is create a limited trade format. So we really got a big difference between the two games. Now, while these changes are where things start to split for the two games, there is one thing that was consistent through all of the last 10 years for them, as far as I can tell, and that is the scoring systems. So let's get that out of the way. Fantasy has the basic stats that we've come accustomed to. Basic in the sense it's the things like kicks, marks, hitouts, tackles, all these types of things. Whereas Supercoach opted for a more advanced metric that is powered by champion data and more closely aligns to how a player's actual performance is. Those scores in each game are scaled to 3,300. So you get these effects where players go up and down based on impact of the game and are all kind of relative to each other. This scoring has stayed the same more or less since 2013, as far as I can tell. And then the real divergence in the formats has been around their trades. Salary caps have also been different between the two games, with Supercoach consistently fixing itself at 10 million a year for us to spend on our players, while AFL Fantasy adjusted to mirror the real the real salary cap for the AFL, which means that it adjusts each year based in line with what the real teams have for salary caps at disposal. Next up, we have the rookie prices. So this is the lowest price, or this is the basement price that you could find a rookie at in the respective formats. So maybe somewhat surprisingly or interestingly, the Supercoach basement price in 2013, it exceeds what it is today in 2024. And AFL Fantasy, on the other hand, has gradually adjusted itself up to reflect what is going on with the salary cap, and we'll go through that shortly. But that 102.7k figure is actually more closely aligned to what we have now as a basement in Supercoach. So interesting to see how these things swap around. Pricing in both games has changed, but in 2013 it was more or less the same, which as far as I can tell is that a player's price changed after 3 games, and that was based on the 3 games they had played. So for example, if a rookie started out, they would play round 1, no change, round 2, no change, and then in round 3 it would change from both formats. There's a few other things we're going to cover in this, such as in-year DPP changes, but in 2013, neither format had that. The trade boosts, which Supercoach introduced, no one had that. Rolling lockout is draw an eye of maybe a lot of the fantasy folk that adored a fixed lockout, and this is where it started back in 2013. Supercoach, as far as I can tell, already had a rolling lockout at that point, with fantasy opting for a fixed lockout. For those that haven't played fixed lockout formats before, it basically just means that once the round kicks off for that week, so say for example the Friday night game starts, all of your players, trades, emergencies, vice captains is all locked. You can't change it. So the format, or that fixed format, tends to be enjoyed by those that can't sit around as much on the weekend and adjust to news and laid outs and all that type of stuff. It allows you to kind of fix everything or set it on a Friday night and forget all about it. And then covering off the last two here, we've got the bench. So both formats had 2 ruck emergencies on their bench. So what did they turn into? We'll go into in a little bit. But yes, that is very different to now. And then for the buys, Fantasy had a best 18 and SuperCoach also had best 18, but you could perform an extra trade in each of those buys. So instead of doing 2 trades this week, you could do 3 trades. And as far as I can tell, 2013 was when this best 18 format was introduced. All right, so we're going to skip forward through some of the years now and see how the games have changed over time. So moving forward to 2014, the trades here have changed a little bit. And it's in a weird way. So Fantasy for 1 year, as far as I can tell, back in 2014, let you do unlimited trades after week 1. So for round 1, you got a free hit. And then before round 2 started, you could swap your whole team out. But then after that, it went back to the normal format, which is really interesting because it was talked about as one of the options in 2024, but for some reason wasn't liked. And maybe it was from learnings back then, who knows. The salary cap for both formats tied up at 10 mil each this year, which is just coincidence. The rookie price, we can see that changed. So SuperCoach introduced the basement price of 102.4K, while, as I mentioned, the rookie price for Fantasy starts increasing in line with that salary cap and will continue to go up over future years. Pricing, we see a big change here for AFL Fantasy. And one of the things to note is in 2014, I believe, is when AFL Fantasy split away from Virtual Sports, which powers SuperCoach still to this day, and built their own platform. So they started to make, I think, a fair few changes in this year based off the back of that. Virtual Sports then retained the Dream Team title, which kind of 2013 and before is what AFL Fantasy was called. And then from 2014 onwards, AFL Fantasy, really had the branding that we've got today. One of the changes they made, and this is a really big one on both pricing and pricing changes, but instead of it being a 3-round average to determine price changes, it became 5-round rolling average. That's the best way to describe it. No longer just 3 games, but 5 games that they take into that price. And on top of that, prices for AFL Fantasy started moving after 1 week or 1 game of being played, whereas for SuperCoach, it remained the same and continues to be this way, which is that you have a rolling 3-round average to determine what your price will be or your price movements, and that only starts moving for a player after they've played 3 games. So after round 1, a fantasy player's price will move. After round 3, a SuperCoach player's price will move. Next up in 2014, we have the introduction of DPP, which was introduced into Fantasy, which means at rounds 6, 12, and 18, I believe it is, players can gain eligibility for other positions. So if I was a mid, I might get forward status as long as I'd played enough forward time throughout the year. Other changes that were made at this time were, no more. So let's jump into 2017 here, fast forwarding a couple of years. There weren't changes made all the time for these formats. Obviously salary caps and rookie prices and all that type of stuff were changing. But in terms of major changes for the game, 2017 was when the next ones came in. So for Fantasy, they introduced extra trades for bye weeks. So it wasn't just 2 trades a week. Now for buys, you could have 3 trades in those bye weeks to help that out. Salary cap still going up, rookie price, basement price still going up for Fantasy as well. And then the only other big change in 2017 was in SuperCoach. And in 2017, they changed the 2nd ruck emergency to the 3rd mid emergency that we have today. So in Fantasy, you only have 2 mid emergencies, but in SuperCoach, it is 3. And yeah, so for the buys here, just to close it out, which is kind of set above, but the format changed to best 18 in Fantasy, plus you'd have the extra trades, which is what SuperCoach has standard across both formats. All right, fast forward to 2020, and there was a lot that changed in 2020. COVID times and 2020, 2021 was a pretty volatile period. What I've tried to do is move out a lot of that noise and just leave in the changes that actually stuck post that period of time. So, salary cap went up, rookie price went up, and then moving down to lockout, that is where fantasy moved from fixed lockout to rolling lockout, just because of the turbulence with teams and COVID ins and outs and all that stuff during that 2020 period. They moved to a rolling format, and it has stuck since then. I know a fair few people have been polling and asking, hey, can we move it back to fixed? But it seems like most people in terms of surveys actually prefer the rolling format, and so they've stuck with that. The other change that was made in 2020 was in the fantasy format to how the bench worked. So they took that second ruck spot, and instead of making it a third mid spot like SuperCoach did, they introduced a utility position. For those that are SuperCoaches and haven't played fantasy, a utility spot is simply a position on your bench that could be filled by someone from any line or row. So it could be a third mid that you put there, and I think it often is, but it could be a second ruck still. It could be another defender, another forward, all those types of things. Moving on to 2022, and that is when we saw the next big change from SuperCoach, with them going from 30 trades to 35 trades. And this is pretty big. We're going to talk about, in terms of impact and learning this period from 2022 onwards, because we see a lot of this stuff starting to bear out. But we went to 35 trades in 2022. In SuperCoach also added in-year DPP, so matched what fantasy had, and then it introduced trade boosts, which was a new concept. So at 5 certain weeks throughout the year, well, not at certain weeks, but any 5 weeks you choose, you could activate a trade boost and you would get +1 trades for that week. So for example, in round 4, I could activate a trade boost and have 3 trades instead of 2. And in buys, you could activate it and actually go to 4 trades instead of 3 if you really wanted to as well. 2023, there is just one change here, which is that SuperCoach went from 35 to 36 trades. They added an extra one for the extra round that was being played. And then we moved to 2024, where SuperCoach has gone from 36 to 40 trades, which a lot of people are unhappy about, but we're going to learn how to make the most of that. And then lastly, for the buys here, we started skipping round 0, which both formats did the same thing on. And so that's a very brief history of fantasy and SuperCoach, where they started and where they're at today. And it's important to learn about these things because for SuperCoach, the strategy that a lot of people employed hadn't changed from 2013 up until really 2022, I would say. And that is the guns and rookies approach to playing fantasy sport. In this approach, you pick a whole bunch of really top guys that you think are going to end up in the top of their line. So a top 6 defender or forward, a top 8 mid, or a top 2 ruck. And then you fill out the rest of your team with cheap rookie price players that will make a lot of cash. And that is how you organize your side for the year. Now, the reason this was done is because a lot of the mid-price speculative type players that we may look at these days, you couldn't afford back then. This was especially true when you had 20 and 24 trades for SuperCoach, but it was also true when you had 30. If you had a team of, say, 12 premiums to start the year that you held on and were fine for the whole year, you still only had 30 trades to get 10 more premiums in. And then you had to account for any injuries or anything like that, any of those sideways trades that you need to do throughout the year. It's a very tight spot to be in. And that is why teams couldn't really afford to go after mid prices that may cost them extra trades if they didn't pan out or weren't keepers and all that type of stuff. And guns and rookies reigned supreme as the dominant strategy. Now in 2017, things changed a little bit in the fantasy landscape. So in 2017, they'd had now, 3 years or maybe it was 4 years actually, of seasons being played where they had this unlimited trade format. But 2017 saw a new person rise to the top of the heat, and that was Selby, coach of Moreira's Magic. You've probably heard of him before. But he won in 2017 and then also backed that up by winning again in 2018. He'd had other top 100 performances around this time. And what was interesting about Selby's win is that he did it with a team very different to what a lot of others were starting at the time. And his win in 2017 was so dominant. I think he won by 300 or 400 points. So I'm somewhat guessing, but he won by a lot in that 2017 year. And really, the big thing that he did differently was starting to look at value and using these extra trades effectively to get up a leg up on the competition, going away from guns and rookies and kind of abandoning that approach a little bit to start looking at where you could find value at other price points, comparing what they're priced at to what you think they're valuable at, and really playing this value aggressive trade game. And it panned out well, obviously winning 2 Highlights in back-to-back years. Now, fast forward a little bit to 2022 and what happened in SuperCoach. Well, for the first time in nearly 10 years at that point, we had an increase in trades. We went from 30 to 35. And this so happens to coincide with the year that Selby of Moreau's Magic decided to make a debut in SuperCoach. After, I think, 2018, he may have played one more year, but more or less retired from fantasy and started providing advice. And he didn't feel like it was fair to compete against the people he was providing advice to, especially given it was paid content at the time. And he would have been caught in a hard place between, do I give the best advice or do I hold back? Which one do I go ahead with? But no qualms on the SuperCoach front. So he debuted in 2022 and I think finished top 10 in his first year. And what did he do in SuperCoach in that first year? He employed the same strategy of fantasy. He looked for value in different ways to how SuperCoach players traditionally did, which was still guns and rookies. It's what we've been playing for 10 years at that point. And was able to use those extra trades to be more aggressive, to get more value, and to get points on the board. That same year is also when Abs Magic, who's on YouTube, I'm sure you've also heard of him, the Skodfather himself, was able to finish top 10. And he is also someone that played a very aggressive style, much more aggressive than what traditional coaches that were one or near the top played. So that was always his style. And with the extra trades, it worked out. And this is partly where I think we can start to learn from fantasy and the players and the tools that they employ, because in the years since then, we've now gone up to 40 trades. And, we saw this last year too. Those that landed value in 2023 were the teams that did the best. And in 2024, we're getting the same type of shock from 2020 basically to 2022. We're getting an extra 5 trades more or less, which is big. We've now got almost as many trades as fantasy does. I believe the fantasy trades this year ends up being 49 and SuperCoach is at 40. So over 80% of the trades that fantasy has, SuperCoach players now have. And on top of that, we actually have other tools to be aggressive as well with trade boosts. So yeah, really, really interesting position that we are now in. Not only that, but rookies as a percentage of our cap are cheaper than that in fantasy as well. And so maybe you can probably tell where I'm starting to head with this, but the strategies that I think we need to employ this year for SuperCoach are largely based on how we've been playing fantasy for the last few years, which is very aggressively. Now, in 2022, I also did a code swap. I played fantasy in this unlimited world for the first time. I thought if Selby's coming over to SuperCoach, I'll have a dip at fantasy. And in 2022 and 2023, I went top 100 back to back, got hats for each year, and learned a fair bit about their trading methods and the tools that they kind of use to evaluate whether a player is worth having or not. And that is what we're going to dive into a little bit deeper. What are some of those metrics and keys that we should be looking at? And how do we determine which players we should be going after? How should we be structuring our sides? When do we trade players? All that type of stuff. But that is going to be saved for a future video. At this point, I will just leave you with this beautiful table of the short, concise history of changes to fantasy and SuperCoach over the last couple of years. And hopefully it starts to illuminate for you why we should be paying more attention to fantasy and fantasy strategies, because at no other point in the last 10 years have we ever been closer to the same game as fantasy, despite changes in scoring and a few price changes here and there. We've actually gone yeah, like we diverged through the last 10 years, and we've definitely converged back at 2024. And I'm keen to use those extra traits to my advantage, and I hope you are too. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.